You're listening to This Way Up, the Arctic Council podcast bringing you stories and experiences from the Arctic. I'm Jessica Cook of the Arctic Council Secretariat.
And I'm Rosa-Máren Magga of the Arctic Council Indigenous Peoples Secretariat. And welcome to what was supposed to be the very first episode of This Way Up, the new Arctic Council podcast.
Yes, so technically we're releasing this as the second episode. So in the summer, we released an episode about Arctic wildfires early because of the devastating start to the 2025 wildfire season.
Exactly. But now we are all back in order, and we thought we would give a brief introduction to who we are, why we have a podcast, and what the Arctic Council is.
But in a fun way.
Yes, no lectures here.
But it is important to just set the scene because the Arctic Council is somewhat complex, but we really want more people to understand what it is and what it does.
So we got 3 Arctic Council representatives into an elevator to do an elevator pitch with us during a busy international conference.
Yeah, we challenged them to tell us something about the Arctic Council in a very short time it took to get from the ground floor to the 8th floor.
And then at the Arctic Council Secretariat and the Indigenous Peoples Secretariat, we host a lot of student groups throughout the year. So we thought it would be fun to ask a group of bachelor students to write down their burning questions for the Arctic Council. And we will go through some of those as well.
But first, maybe we should tell you a little bit about the voices behind the mic. So, Rosa-Máren, what is the elevator pitch of why you're here today recording the Arctic Council podcast?
Yes, that's a good question. I think for me, naturally, the fact that I am from the Arctic, I'm from Sápmi, from the Finnish part of Sápmi, born and raised, and also my interests are in the Arctic, what is happening in the Arctic, environmental issues, international indigenous politics and diplomacy. So all of those combined, as well as my studies that have supported this indigenous studies that I studied both in Finland and Canada, as well as my past work experience, I would say. So all of that combined has probably brought me here. What about you, Jess?
Yeah, so I'm not from the Arctic personally. So I'm from a small town in the US, but my professional background is in communications. And sometime in my early 20s, I took a couple of trips to the Arctic. And I think that really that really stuck with me. I developed sort of a passion for the region just from my short experiences there during that time. And I was working in corporate at the time at a corporate PR agency. And I saw a position open up at the Arctic Council Secretariat, and I thought this is such a perfect way to combine both my professional background and then also my personal interest in the Arctic. So that's how I sort of find myself here today.
Thanks for sharing that. And Jess, if I may ask, what is one of your most memorable Arctic moments?
Ooh, this is a tough one. I think, one memory that really comes to mind first is maybe last winter. I was sitting in this open field under the northern lights in the middle of winter, and it was so peaceful. There has been a light snowfall, and the sky was just completely open to these beautiful dancing northern lights. And I was all alone, but then I suddenly sort of got a feeling like there was someone or something watching me, and it made me a little bit nervous. And I'm not usually nervous when I'm outside, but in the distance I saw what I thought were bushes. But then I noticed like these bushes were slowly moving closer to me, and then I took when they got closer, I realized that it was not bushes; it was reindeer. So they were just very quietly grazing in the distance, and it was so peaceful. It was just such a nice, peaceful moment here in the Arctic, and I think that is a moment that sticks with me. But how about you?
It's probably difficult to distinct or have only one very memorable moment because I'm born and raised in the Arctic. But I would say that so I'm from a Sami reindeer herding family and reindeer husbandry traditional reindeer husbandry is very close to my heart, and that's the main economy to my family. So all of the seasonal work I try to participate, and I have done that since I was very small. So all of the seasonal work, let's say during the summer, the calf marking time, that's a really nice time of a year. So the bright summer nights when we are marking our calves, that's very special with our Sita, our family and reindeer. And also in the wintertime, like gathering the reindeer for the corrals, for the reindeer roundup. I would say that just all of that seasonal work is that's really special time.
Mm. Now that you've gotten to learn a little bit more about us, let's step into the elevator and talk about the Arctic Council now.
And maybe we need to have a pre-elevator pitch about the council, because there's terms we throw around a lot, like permanent participant and senior Arctic official, but what do they actually mean?
Yeah, so very briefly, the Arctic Council is the leading forum for cooperation between Arctic states and Arctic Indigenous peoples on issues of environmental protection and sustainable development. It was established in 1996, so we're almost in our 30s.
A milestone.
So the council is made up of 8 Arctic states that have territory above the Arctic Circle, and each state appoints a representative to the Arctic Council. These state representatives are called senior Arctic officials, and they represent their country in the Arctic Council.
And then we have a special category, permanent participants. These are Arctic Indigenous peoples organizations that sit at the same table as nation states. Now, this is a unique status in international cooperation. There are 6 permanent participants.
We like to say that the engine of the Arctic Council is really its working groups. They address topics like Arctic peoples, biodiversity, climate, ocean, pollutants, and emergencies. So this is where the project level work is carried out.
Okay, so without further ado, let's step into the elevator and hear from Arctic Council representatives themselves.
Let's start with Patrick Huber, who is chair of the Arctic Contaminants Action Program Working Group. We ask him an existential question. What is the Arctic Council's role?
I think the Arctic Council has 2 important roles. First, as a convener of a broad spectrum of interdisciplinary actors, cross-sector individuals who represent Indigenous peoples and the member states of the Arctic to develop solutions for keeping the Arctic a healthier place for everybody. And the second is to give voice to the people of the Arctic, a collective voice to communicate both within and outside of the Arctic Council to talk about what we can all do together to make the Arctic a better place.
Next, we step into the elevator with Gun-Britt Retter of the Sami Council, one of the permanent participants of the Arctic Council.
So Gun-Britt, what makes the Arctic Council special?
What makes Arctic Council so special is Arctic Indigenous peoples organizations having a role as permanent participants at the Council. And I consider that a means of democratization, recognizing the rights Indigenous peoples have to be at the table. And what we bring to that space is Indigenous knowledge systems that are so deeply embodied in our cultures and represents a link to intergenerational exchange and multifaceted, systematic way of thinking, being, and acting.
Thank you, Gun-Britt. Back on the first floor. Finally, we got Petteri Vuorenmäki, Senior Arctic Official for Finland, and asked him what he thinks is a common misunderstanding about the Council.
So, Petteri, there is quite a lot of misunderstanding of what the Arctic Council is and what it isn't. Could you debunk the Arctic Council for us?
Sure. A lot of people thought that the Arctic Council collapsed in 2022 following Russia's attack. It did not. The Arctic Council is still alive with 8 member states and 6 permanent participants. It is up and running. It is the most important cooperation format in circumpolar Arctic. It is hugely important for the indigenous peoples to sit at the same table with the governments, and that makes the council unique. And it is, after all, the council that brought the Arctic climate change to the global attention. It's done wonderful things during the 28 years of its existence.
This was such a fun exercise.
It really was. And we had to redo it so many times because we kept having random visitors getting on the elevator.
If you ever want to test your elevator pitch skills under pressure, doing it at a venue at a major international conference is definitely the place to do it.
Let's now turn to the student group and the questions they wrote down for us. Okay, so question number 1. What are current issues or priorities of the Arctic Council being discussed?
Ooh, good question. Well, honestly, one of the advantages of the Arctic Council, its different working groups and big network of experts, is that it can cover so many different topics at the same time. So there are many different Arctic issues or topics being addressed. And then off the top of my head, some of the big ones are monitoring environmental changes, reducing marine litter. There's a big action plan for this now that's being implemented. Emergency preparedness, like how Arctic states are prepared to respond to a radiation incident, or educating small communities on how to develop an emergency response plan. Biodiversity is a big one, so monitoring the status of Arctic species, and also conservation measures like marine protected areas and other effective conservation measures. Mental health is big, as has been the preservation of Indigenous languages. Indigenous food cultures has also been a big one, including the development of a cookbook made by Indigenous youth, and also an Indigenous food lab. So yeah, there's a lot.
And now when you brought up those Indigenous-led projects, also permanent participants have their own priorities as Indigenous peoples' organizations that represents their peoples and their values, but they also have some common priorities that they work jointly with.
True. And then each state that chairs the Arctic Council comes in with their own priorities. So right now, the Kingdom of Denmark chairs the Arctic Council, and they have 5 key priorities. And those are oceans, Indigenous peoples and communities of the Arctic, sustainable economic development and energy transition solutions, oceans, and climate change in the Arctic. So these overarching priorities sort of set the agenda every 2 years, and working groups advance their projects according to 2-year work plans.
Mm. And moving on to question number 2. What does it mean to be a permanent participant versus a member state? And what difference do these statuses make? And this is a very good question. A bit earlier we heard from Gun-Britt Retter about the special role Indigenous peoples play in the Arctic Council as permanent participants. But just to speak broadly about international multilateral organizations, these are usually created by states for states. So they have a seat at the table and are the ones making decisions. Indigenous peoples have fought for their seat at the table for decades, longer even. But for most organizations, Indigenous peoples are more like observers. And what makes the Arctic Council unique is that when it was first created, Arctic Indigenous peoples demanded a seat at the same table as nation states and would not back down and pave their way to be seated at the same table. We can credit this to Mary Simon, who is currently Governor General of Canada, but at the time was lead negotiator for the founding document of the Arctic Council. She and other Indigenous peoples' representatives negotiated so that they would have a special status called permanent participants. So they are more than just observers. They are actively involved in negotiations and decisions and setting the agenda.
Yes, and so formally on paper, Arctic states have decision-making rights, and the permanent participants have consultation rights. But the way the Arctic Council has operated is that if the permanent participants have a stance on a certain topic or decision item, states won't just ignore this. They are fundamentally involved in every negotiation. And importantly, they contribute on the working level as well as Indigenous knowledge holders and experts that participate in projects.
Next up, we have, how does the Council navigate political tensions or changes?
This is a great question. And I think the answer is in the makeup of the Council. So when it was established, the Arctic states agreed that all issues of military security will be excluded from being discussed in the Council. That's huge. And the fact that the Council doesn't deal with security has, in a way, shielded it from some geopolitical issues. The other part of this is that the Arctic Council is a consensus organization between 8 states. So geopolitical issues are generally handled bilaterally or in other forums. The Council's mandate is very clear that it addresses issues of environmental protection and sustainable development. And I think that some people may wrongly assume that the Arctic Council just sits around a table and discusses big power politics, but in all reality, they're around the table discussing phasing out harmful firefighting foams, or how to empower youth, or engaging Indigenous peoples more thoroughly.
I think that's probably all the questions we have time for at the moment. But if you, the listener, have any questions about the Arctic Council you would like us to answer or address, please feel free to reach out to us using the email address media@arctic-council.org, or anything specifically addressed to the Indigenous Peoples Secretariat, ips@arctic-council.org. Before we end this episode, maybe we should quickly touch on why we are making this podcast and what we hope to achieve with it.
Yes, so we've been talking about doing a podcast for a long time now, so we're really excited to release the very first season. And one of our goals from the very beginning was to highlight stories from the Arctic that focus on communities and issues that are important for the people in the Arctic. The storytelling aspect was also very important, that it isn't just a lecture-style podcast.
So in each episode, you will hear from different people from the Arctic or working with the Arctic, discuss different topics and sharing their stories. And Jessica and I will be narrating, weaving stories together and helping to connect the dots.
We also know that some of the topics we cover can be pretty complex. We'll touch on topics like food security, cultures in transition, climate change, and the likes. But we try to not make it all doom and gloom. Because while the Arctic is changing, there are some really unique and inspiring solutions out there to the challenges that we face. So as much as a lot of these topics can bring about feelings of helplessness, there is a lot of room for hope. We really believe that. And we want you to see that too.
Whether you live in the Arctic, are familiar with the region, or just curious, we hope that each episode gives insights or new perspectives on key Arctic issues, and perhaps even inspires you to take action. We hope you will tune in and be sure to rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Thanks for listening to This Way Up from the Arctic Council Secretariat and Indigenous Peoples Secretariat. This episode was hosted by Rosa-Máren Magga and Jessica Cook. It was developed and written by Jessica Cook, Rosa-Máren Magga, and Minetta Westerlund. The music in this episode is by Emil Carlsen, used with permission. Sound design by Bode Oak Studios. The views expressed in this episode do not reflect those of the Arctic states and permanent participants. A full list of sources and references can be found on our website, arctic-council.org.